Welcome, everybody. Sorry about that. But thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on patient-focused drug development, on innovations in clinical outcome assessments, and on what it's like for patients to live with edema from nephrotic syndrome. My name is Laurel. I'm the Executive Director of the International Society of Glomerular Disease. And as it so happens, I am also a person who has gone through kidney failure from SGS. So I have experienced the whole edema roller coaster myself. And I am so pleased to welcome our panelists today to talk about the progress that's being made in patient-focused outcomes and how this will contribute to better treatments in the future for nephrotic syndrome. So joining us today, our moderator is Barbara Gillespie, who I'm sure many of you know. She is the VP and Therapeutic Head of Nephrology at Fortree, and she is also an adjunct professor at the University of North Carolina. That I would say doesn't even begin to cover the number of things that she's involved in. She is a member of our clinical trials committee here at ISGD. She's served on the Kidney Health Initiative Board of Directors, and just in general, if there's a work group or advisory board or steering committee going on that has something to do with advances in nephrology, you can usually find her on it. I welcome also Devin Pipert, who's an assistant professor at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. And he specializes in researching patient-reported outcomes. He's actually a psychometrician who specializes in developing and validating clinical outcome assessments. So really digging into how we evaluate and understand patients' functionality, symptoms, and well-being in a scientifically valid way. And he is the co-PI of Prepare-NS, along with Dr. Eloise Salmon, who we also have here. He leads the quantitative study design and execution, the psychometric analyses, and quantitative data interpretation in the study. Dr. Eloise Salmon is a clinical assistant professor of pediatric nephrology at the University of Michigan, and she treats patients with a range of needs, including dialysis and transplant, as well as earlier stages of kidney disease. And within Prepare-NS, she leads the stakeholder engagement activities, serves as a liaison with the NIH-sponsored consortia, Neptune and CureGN, and leads the implementation of multi-site study procedures that leverage that Neptune and CureGN infrastructure. She is a co-PI on the study along with Devin. And we welcome also today Seferiana Day, who is a person with membranous nephropathy. She was diagnosed in 2016 at age 30 and lives in Seattle, Washington, along with her partner, her cat, and a new dog. And she's an expert in local government. She's worked in politics for over a decade, supporting first-time candidates. She also holds a master's in social work and spends her spare time reading, running, and loves to travel to see art. So thank you all so much for being with us here today. Just a few housekeeping notes. You can type questions anytime using the Q&A button that you see on your screen, and we'll address those at the end of the webinar. We have time set aside for a Q&A discussion. When we're in that Q&A period, you'll also be able to click the raise hands button. So if you want to speak your question out loud. And if closed captions are helpful to you, you can access them with the show captions button within Zoom. All right, without any further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Barbara.
Okay, thanks for those lovely introductions for all of us, Laurel. And Laurel, you should all know, is the person who keeps every train on the track that is happening in glomerular disease. So thanks, Laurel, for getting us together today. Okay, so welcome everyone. Happy New Year. This is my first webinar of the year, so kind of feeling refreshed. And I took a look at the names. I recognize a couple names of patients I've worked with and on different committees, but I actually don't recognize a lot of the names, which is really exciting to me because I hope we've got a new crowd that we haven't spoken to before. So thanks for joining, everyone. Okay, so the goals of today are listed here. First and foremost, we want to hear about Seferiana's experience, and maybe some of it you'll find similar to your own, dealing with volume overload during her journey with nephrotic syndrome. We want to understand the impact of patients' perspectives, like hers and yours, on global regulatory decision-making. So that's just a fancy way of saying, the FDA, EMA, all the authorities who are approving drugs and devices for any therapeutic area, but of course for kidney disease, you'll see that what patients say really matter to them, and it really folds into how they make decisions about approving things. You'll learn about clinical outcome assessments, we call COAs, COA. There are 4 types of them: PROs, ClinRO, OBSRO, PERFO. You'll hear more from Devin later about Prepare-NS and what that's looking at. And just as a preview, COAs are a type of qualitative research. So this is research we do not by, giving a drug or device, but actually conducting patient surveys, focus groups, and interviews, because your input, again, it really matters to support FDA approvals of new therapies. And just as a reminder, I work mostly here in the US and with the FDA. And so a lot of my comments are really US centric, but I know that the other regulatory agencies across the world are also thinking about how to, bring in patient perspectives. Same idea, just kind of different documents, I would say. And then finally, shine the spotlight on this particular project called Prepare-NS, because we'd like to further engage other sites and PIs, and most importantly, patients with nephrotic syndromes. Again, the more you tell us, the better we are going to do at our jobs in designing better clinical trials that ultimately get new drugs and devices approved for nephrotic syndrome. Okay. So Laurel, if anyone has a question, can they just jump in, or is it just going to be all by chat?
So what we'll do is you can either put your questions in the Q&A and we'll address those at the end. We'll really have a Q&A discussion with all of the panelists and all of the questions. Or if it's something that we can address via that chat, we can answer it in that Q&A dialogue. And if it's something that you really want to unmute and talk about during the Q&A, we can also do that at the end.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's get rolling with the next slide. Okay, so I put the title as Engage Patients. It's the law. And so I talked to a lot of sponsors, and I've heard some crazy things from them over the years saying, oh, it's just like, it's a nice thing to do. And, it's kind of the new thing to do. It's not new. It's been around for decades. And in fact, it was made into law with the 21st Century Cures Act in December 2016. And so the goal of this act is to accelerate discovery, development, and delivery of new products. And it's divided into 4 titles. And the third title, to speed up development, you can see right there in orange, patient-focused drug development and associated guidance documents, and getting patient experience data to support new approvals. So you're going to hear more about this law from Devin a little bit later, but I just wanted to drop it right here because, again, we're engaging patients because it's the law. We know it's important to do, but FDA is really paying attention to this. Next slide, please. So let's just take a step back and think about what the U.S. Food and Drug Administration does. So their mission, and I just highlighted the keywords in yellow, is to protect the public health, our health, by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of the products that they approve for human use. And so efficacy is just a fancy word for saying something works, okay? They're responsible for advancing public health by helping to speed up innovations that make products more effective, safe, and affordable. They do this by helping to get helping the public get accurate and science-based information. But part of that accurate and science-based information, again, is hearing from patients. Next slide, please. So the FDA reviewers themselves have expert knowledge on certain areas across clinical development, but they are approving therapies by evaluating the risk-benefit profile, so safety and does it work, from clinical trials, but also from an array of other studies. And you'll see one slide that lists these kind of studies that includes the patient experience. Next slide, please. So getting a drug approved takes many years and many patients. And, we say anywhere from 5 to 15 years. The things you saw with the COVID vaccine approvals, those were emergency use authorizations, so not typical. But it takes a lot of patience, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of money. And I personally believe that the sooner we have good tools for clinical outcome assessments, the better. So we really should be developing these tools, in the phase 1-2 area. So by the time you get to phase 3, which are the pivotal trials that get something approved, you already have that work done and validated. Next slide, please. So there are a couple different types of clinical studies. I think most of us are aware of the interventional study, where someone is given an actual intervention, a drug, a device, and see if it's safe and see if it works. The other two studies listed here, observational studies and qualitative research, this is where you're not doing anything, physical. I mean, you're not giving them an intervention, but you're observing how they're doing and looking at their experience. And then you're also talking to patients, the qualitative research. And this is where those clinical outcome assessments fall. This is where you're gathering information from patients with interviews, surveys, and focus groups to establish behavioral patterns. And again, what matters most to patients? So patient-reported outcomes about, you tell us, what about your leg swelling? How does it impact your life? And we hope to use this and incorporate that into clinical trials as an endpoint to say, maybe this drug improves your proteinuria, but maybe this certain drug actually also improves your leg swelling and your ability to walk when you've got 4+ edema. Next slide, please. Okay, so the FDA is committed to integrating patient perspective into its decision-making. And that's a quote from the FDA Commissioner, Dr. Rob Califf. Here are examples of how qualitative research have actually impacted the FDA's decision-making. So on the far left, there was an obesity device, this was several years ago, that went through a trial, and it didn't meet its original endpoint. It was a negative trial in 233 patients. However, the FDA sponsored a survey in 540 patients to ask if they would accept the risk associated with that device. And lo and behold, the patient said yes. And in 2015, this device was the first FDA-approved device of its kind since 2007, based on just the patient feedback. So again, the trial was negative. It, didn't work that well, but because of the safety, the patient's willingness to accept the risk, the device got approved. So that is an example, a great example of patient survey really taking precedence. In the middle there's patient experience, and this many of you may have heard of a drug called rituximab. It was first approved back in 1997 for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. We use it in kidney disease for a lot of nephrotic syndrome, glomerular disease. In 2017, the formula, a subcutaneous formula was developed, and it was given over 6 minutes, in contrast to 1.5 hours of the IV. And so the company, Genentech, did a survey, 3 questions to patients. Do you prefer the sub-Q 6 minutes or the 1.5 hour IV? And the overwhelming response was the sub-Q. So the FDA was able to approve the sub-Q formulation, not having to do a whole nother study, but just based on the patient experience. And so for the first time ever in the drug label section, they created a new section called patient experience, and it describes this. And so again, this was brand new just a few years ago. That was about a year after the 21st Century Cures Act. And then finally, on to the far right, patient preference information. So the next stage device is a home hemo machine. First got cleared in 2005 and then cleared again for nocturnal use in 2014. Well, the survey was conducted to see if patients would be willing to perform dialysis on themselves without a patient care partner and to identify if this was going to be a big risk. And again, the patient said yes. And so in 2018, this is the first time something had been approved already, but then got an expanded indication to use this machine without a care partner. So obviously that increased independence for patients using the machine. But again, patient experience, patient preference. Next slide, please. And to go back to that middle example, the patient experience, I want to tell you about something I find really exciting. There was a drug approved for dialysis patients with pruritus, which means itch. The drug is called Korsuva or difelikefalin. And the remarkable thing about the studies is that the primary endpoint was purely patient-reported outcomes. And so this is publicly available data. This is the sheet that the sponsor submitted to the FDA. And you can see the patient experience data is a separate section. And the FDA is asking the sponsor to apply to check all the things that they did regarding patient experience as part of their package to get approved. Now, this particular sponsor only submitted PRO data. They submitted a lot of it. If you can go back to the previous slide. But the other things on the list that sponsors can submit are those other COAs that I've mentioned already, patient-focused drug development and other reports, which Devin will talk about, patient preference studies, like I talked about with the home hemo next stage machine, and observational studies that was listed on the slide. Now, you don't want to be the sponsor next to the red arrow where they say patient experience data was not submitted as part of this application, because I believe, and we've seen this many times, that the patient experience can really influence the FDA's decision-making. Next slide, please. And I want to point out, this is the trial, and the results on the left show that it was a positive trial, that the drug worked and decreased itch. But what's fascinating to me is the primary endpoint was one simple question there in the bottom right. The one simple question was, indicate the severity of your worst itching in the last 24 hours from 0 to 10. That was the one question that got this drug approved. Now, they asked other questions and other surveys for their secondary endpoint, and I wasn't part of the approval process. But again, this drug was approved not based on labs, not based on GFR or proteinuria, not based on whether they need dialysis or not. It was just based on what the patients reported. So very exciting. And I'm really happy to see this precedent in nephrology, and I hope to see more examples of this. Okay, I think that's my last slide. Thank you. Okay, so I think for the next part, Eloise will be interviewing Seraphina, and I think I'll just go on mute and let you guys take over.
Good morning and afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is just a little bit of background from Ms. Day, and we are delighted to have her with us. And we can go ahead to the next slide and start with our questions. And so as we've approached development of our outcome assessments, really one of our primary goals is not to make any assumptions about the experience of the patient. And so today we'll give you a sense of how some of our conversations went with study participants over the course of the study. And we'll ask Ms. Day a series of questions about her experience with swelling, starting with the weeks leading up to diagnosis. If you don't mind just sharing with us sort of what you remember from that time and how swelling impacted your daily life during those weeks.
Sure. I think that, well, first of all, thank you for having me here to chat about my experience. I appreciate the opportunity. I think the first thing I noticed different was the swelling. I think I woke up one late October morning. I remember actually very vividly waking up and feeling swelling in my ankles. And it was really subtle. It didn't come on all of a sudden, but it was just that little bit of swelling that felt different and was alarming to me. And in those first few days, it would kind of go away during the day and come back. Like I would go to bed, I would wake up the next morning, it would be there. And then it kind of just got worse. It kind of snowballed, I think, where, I would go to bed and it would subside. And I would wake up in the morning and it would kind of get worse as the day went on. And that, I would say that continued for a whole year. But it really took about 3 months for me to actually get diagnosed, from the time that I first kind of woke up that day, noticed swelling, and pretty quickly went to my doctor and said, this is different, this is weird, what's going on? Because otherwise I was pretty healthy and had no other symptoms. And so that was really the first one that I noticed and just got my attention. Yeah. But yeah,
And
I was diagnosed in February, so it was kind of that October was the first time when I felt it, and then took a few months to get actually diagnosed.
And over that journey from diagnosis through initiation of treatment and beyond, do you have a memory of your worst day of swelling that you experienced and what life was like on that particular day?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the worst day, I weighed myself and I had gained 30 pounds of water weight. And that was probably at the height, I was carrying about 30 pounds of water weight. I think I can actually think of a few different scenarios of, when I was first diagnosed, or like right before I was first diagnosed, I was an avid runner. And on my worst day, I could not run. I could barely comfortably walk. And so the swelling was, at first it was just in my ankles, but on my worst day, it was in my legs, it was around my knees, it was in my stomach and my midsection, it was everywhere. And I think at the time I was also on prednisone. And so I was on prednisone from diagnosis until about 2017, so about a year, when I did rituximab. And so the prednisone actually made it worse because I had swelling in my back. Like I was like, my body just feels so different. I can't control it. And it's just happening to me. And so just kind of that also built on, that medication did not help, kind of made it worse. And so one of the memories I had though was going to a fundraiser because I was working in politics. I was active. This was pre-COVID. I went to a fundraiser. I think I was wearing heels, and an hour into the night, I was like so uncomfortable. I'm like, I just had to leave early because my feet hurt. I was embarrassed because my foot, is swollen and I can't, I'm like, it was painful and I was so uncomfortable. And so I left early. I remember I would do like these relay races. I did a relay with friends, and I see pictures of myself with, the pitting edema in my ankles and in my legs were just like tree trunks. And that's how it felt. It was just this feeling of like weightiness that I couldn't get off. And that, yeah, but I feel like it's not like one day that I remember, but it's just this image of what was it at the worst. And it was that it hurt to walk. It hurt to, I couldn't run. It was just very limiting.
Absolutely. And I think you've described really nicely the impact of the lower extremity edema in particular and its limitations on mobility, on appearance, on participation activities. Was there swelling in other body parts that you felt like got in your way or impacted your day-to-day life in a negative way?
Yes, I think in the face was another one, which I think also the prednisone didn't help with. I also, I was on a couple of medications before the rituximab. I was also on cyclosporin, and that also, one of my initial reactions was my face swelled up, and they kind of had to change the dose. But that was big, and I think I'll talk about this later, but still like face swelling or eyelid swelling, and it's very alarming. I remember my boyfriend at the time coming over and being like, "What's wrong with you? Like, are you okay?" And it was very shocking to see just the face swelling, because you don't know, is it going to stop? Is it going to keep going? And that didn't happen all the time, but there were a couple of times where it was just really noticeable and kind of scary.
And would you mind sharing with us a little bit about your conversations with your care team about swelling? I think you've highlighted what a significant part of the disease experience it is, and the types of questions they were asking. Would there have been anticipatory guidance that would have been helpful from your care team in thinking about edema and how long to expect it and all those sorts of things?
Yeah, I think through my journey, I've had membranous since 2016. Um, the worst of my swelling was probably those first couple of years. And I think initially there was not really an expectation set, but it was, initially it was like, here's some furosemide water pills, take a couple. I would sometimes take more than a couple, and then I would feel, the kind of reaction to having taken too much and feeling a headache and feeling dehydrated and like not being able to find a balance. And I think that my care team was like, it was very much, take some water pills, try some compression socks, put your legs up. And so I was just doing these sort of maintenance things that kind of helped me. But there, it got to the point, when I was carrying those 30 pounds of water weight, that the socks did nothing. It was like, there was not really a way out of it. And I think something that I found through the progression of my disease is that swelling is often it's like the marker, it's the physical marker. I'll go in, I went in last month for an in-person checkup, and my doctor feels my my ankles, and looks good, and I remember going in after my rituximab treatment, which actually made things a lot better. The swelling went down a lot after that in 2017. And going into a different doctor, it wasn't my regular doctor, but he was standing in, and he feels my ankle. Oh, you look great. Kind of like, you must be good, And I'm like, yeah, I might look good on the outside, but I'm not good inside, and things are not, the rituximab did have did take my proteinuria down a lot, but it did not put me into remission. And just that feeling of, it might look better on the outside, but it doesn't actually relate to what's going on inside necessarily. And so it was then, I think, even harder to get that input from the doctors about what could I do for my disease, because that's such an outside kind of effect that's noticed. Yeah.
And I think you've already spoken to this a bit, but when things did begin to improve, especially after the rituximab, what did you notice first as being better?
Gosh, I think I noticed just kind of gradually, because basically every day I would it was almost like waking up was a fresh start, with like the least amount of swelling. And so I think at the worst times I was still swollen. And so it was like starting at a baseline that was higher, So I think I just started noticing I was starting each day a little bit less swollen. And so, and at the end of the day it would be the worst. And so I think that's just kind of what I noticed. It was, I'd wake up and it was a little bit less. At the end of the day, it was a little bit less. I wasn't gaining as much throughout the day. I think that's probably what I noticed first.
And then what about today? Can you tell us a bit about how your experience with swelling continues today, if at all?
Yeah, my swelling, I think, is pretty limited. I think if I eat salty food, I might get a little bit, honestly, like if I eat a salty dinner, I might wake up the next morning and my eyelids are a little bit puffy, that I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have had that. So it's a reminder to be maybe more cautious or just thoughtful with my food. But really it's just gone down so much. It's very, very minimal now. I've had another rituximab round and a maintenance dose, and so I'm kind of doing a lot better than I was back in 2017.
And as this section draws to a close, anything else that you think this audience should know about swelling? We have patients, clinicians, industry representatives, anything you think would be good for those groups to know or hear?
Yeah, I think and maybe this goes back to one of the earlier kind of sub questions around other questions I wish my care providers had asked. I think the biggest impact beyond the physical was the real mental health and emotional impact of swelling. I think I was in my early 30s, and I was like, I'm wanting to live my life. I'm like wanting to find a partner and like do these things, and I felt completely just out of control. Like I had no control over my body, and the body image issues, the feelings of discomfort. It was not brought to me by my doctors. Like I was seeing a therapist at the time for other things, but I never brought this to my therapist. And it was never something that my nephrologist said, like, oh, you might want, like, for one, how are you feeling about this? For two, do you want to talk to someone about it? Because I think we don't often think about the impacts on mental health of diseases, of chronic diseases. And the swelling had such a reaction for me mentally, because I couldn't do what I was used to doing. And I felt just completely out of control with my body. So that was the main thing that sticks out about, how I wished my doctors maybe had more of a holistic view of the impacts of the swelling.
Well, thank you. And thank you again for sharing so much of your experience today. As we conclude, we also wanted to ask you about discussions you had with your nephrologist regarding clinical trials. As Barbara said in opening, having patients represented in clinical trials is deeply important, and we wanted you to just share whether those are conversations you had with your nephrologist over the course of the past number of years.
No, they're not. I've not, yeah, my doctor has not asked me about clinical trials. I've learned about them through my involvement in different organizations. But yeah, we've really not. I think that she stays on top of kind of new medications, but yeah, I've not been discussed clinical trials with my doctor.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining us today, and we'll hand it over to Devin to share a bit more about Prepare and its history. Thank you again.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Surfiana. That was a great bit of context and really powerful story that you have to kind of set up the whole rationale for this project, and I think a good deal of drug development in this area. So a lot of what we're talking about today, including patient-focused type measures as a way to capture the benefit and risks of drugs, goes under the term patient-focused drug development. And according to the USDA or US FDA, that is not the USDA, the US FDA, patient-focused drug development is a systematic approach to help ensure patients' experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities are captured and meaningfully incorporated in drug development evaluation. That sounds like what it is, which is kind of a kind of formal guidance document. But really, this is about sort of systematic scientific approaches to collecting and using the input of patients, caregivers, potentially other key stakeholders to really support evaluation of new drugs and the way that regulators like the FDA make decisions about those drugs in terms of whether or not the drug works and what that means to people. It also includes things like facilitating additional patient enrollment and minimizing burden of participation in clinical research. We just heard from Serafiana that she hadn't been talked to her nephrologist about potential participation in beneficial clinical trials. So expanding access to potentially beneficial new treatments is part of patient-focused drug development. And finally, I think really critically here is identifying information that is most important to patients related to, as I say, treatment benefits, risks, and burdens, and how to best communicate that information to support decision-making about which treatments are right for the patient. So that's what we're up to here. And so next slide. Barbara told you a little bit before about the 21st Century CARES Act, but I'll repeat some of that here because this is a key act in really bringing in the role of patient-focused drug development in our current regulatory setting. And it was there before, but this really kind of crystallize the way we think about patient-focused drug development today. It is part of the Title III, and as Barbara mentioned, all new drug approvals must include a statement about the patient's experience with the drug, and hopefully that's robust patient-centric data. Go ahead and advance. So largely, when we talk about patient experience, we're talking about patient-reported outcomes. Of course, there's other types of clinical outcome assessments, as Barbara mentioned. Those include observer reports. Observers could be like caregivers of young children or people who can't report for themselves. They can be clinician reports, performance measures, but oftentimes we're talking about patient-reported outcomes. And FDA defines a patient-reported outcome this way: any report coming from patients about a health condition and its treatment without interpretation of the patient's response by anyone else. And so really this should be what the patient thinks in a systematic, scientific way. Go ahead and advance. So in the context of nephrotic syndrome, drug development's really active. We recently did a review of clinicaltrials.gov, and if you're not aware, this is a website that the U.S. government hosts to keep track of registered clinical trials. And we found 29 active clinical trials in FSGS focused on nephrotic syndrome, 28 in membranous nephropathy, for instance. Among these and others, 41 were early phase trials. So that means, there's going to be larger, more pivotal trials down the road. And among all of the trials, only 5 had patient-reported outcomes included, and none of those patient-reported outcomes were tailored to the experience of nephrotic syndrome. So the gap is very clear. We need these patient-reported outcomes and other clinical outcome assessments to really have a patient-focused and patient-centric view of new drug development in nephrotic syndrome. You can see the other primary outcome categories in these trials. These are very relevant still, and the focus on patient-reported outcomes is not meant to replace any of these, but to complement them in really bringing in the patient's voice. Go ahead and advance. So a collaboration between University of Michigan and Northwestern Medicine for the Prepare-NS project was considered when FDA said we're interested in getting new clinical outcome assessments around fluid overload in nephrotic syndrome. And so we applied for a grant and were awarded a grant from the FDA to do this in 2021. And the title of our project is Preparing a Clinical Outcome Set, Assessment Set for Nephrotic Syndrome, or in short, Prepare-NS. And that's what we're talking about today. Go ahead and advance. So here's the team. This project is led by Eloise, who you just heard interviewing Serafiana, and myself. We have a whole team of fantastic investigators and participants who are doing all kinds of things. These are some of them, but not in any case the whole group. We have participation across a large number of stakeholder groups and expert groups, and so I just want to represent that. We have maybe Eloise or I sort of standing up talking about it, but this is really the work of an enormous community, and that's the way it should be. Go ahead and advance. So in the broadest sense, the purpose of this project is to develop and validate a publicly available clinical outcome set of clinical outcome assessments for fluid overload fit for drug development for a range of nephrotic syndrome-inducing rare chronic kidney diseases. And so I'll explain a little bit more about what that means in common sense language in the next slides. Go ahead and advance. So this is what we've been up to so far, what we've accomplished, and where we're going as a snapshot, and I'll dig into some details about this. So it's a 5-year project. We've just crossed into year 3. The first 2 years, which was kind of the first phase of the project, was really the formative and planning stages. You can think of it that way. So we started right at the beginning doing very broad but also deep environmental scans, including literature reviews, analyses of well-known registries like Neptune and CureGN to really understand experience of swelling and how patients might report about that, what kind of symptoms or other experiences it affects among patients. other elements to identify where the gaps really were in measurement. Is there anything out there we can use today and bring forward, and what would we need to do that? And then led to drafting some patient-reported and observer-reported outcome measures to potentially validate going forward. So now that's underway. We are examining, how comprehensible and relevant the questions we've chosen are. We're planning a validation study, eliciting tons of stakeholder input, and we'll be analyzing a lot of data and disseminating these. So that's the snapshot. Again, we're just over the hump in starting year 3. Go ahead and advance. So here's a broad picture of how we're thinking about the symptoms that we're looking at in this project. So we know swelling, of course, in this area is driven by biological and physiological processes. That causes fluid overload and fluid overload symptoms and severity. We know fluid overload isn't just the swelling itself, but it causes a range of impacts that we want to cover, that patients or observers of, say, young children could report on. And that's ultimately what we're going to capture in the clinical outcome set that we're building. We also know that social function and mental function, as Serafiana mentioned, are critically important experiences. We're not covering those in this particular project and set of measures because we think and have had some discussion that they're very unlikely to be the most proximal or sort of close impacts that drugs would get evaluated on. And so because that's our mandate in Prepare-NS, we're not necessarily looking at those things directly, but there are other ways we're looking at building to capture those really important aspects of the patient's experience and going to be able to hopefully link to those as well, even though they're not the direct consideration of this particular project that is really focused on clinical trials and drug development. Go ahead and advance. So this is what gets called the context of use for the project, which is, who are the patients we're going to be focusing on, and at the end of the day, what are the inclusion criteria of clinical trials? These won't exactly match those specific inclusion criteria, but this is the kind of patient population you would expect in the clinical trials that are going to use the measures we're building. So age-wise, very, very broad range, starting at 2 years and going all the way up from there, with nephrotic syndrome caused by FSGS, minimal change, IgM nephropathy, membranous nephropathy, and childhood onset, including all levels of kidney function except dialysis dependence. And this includes both persistent and relapsing and remitting. Go ahead and advance. We've done to date a lot of qualitative interviews with both observers of young children and patients experiencing the disease themselves to get information about how do patients experience swelling, what are the impacts, and then what questions do we need in our patient-reported outcomes and our observer-reported outcomes to adequately capture that experience. Go ahead and advance. So here's some quotes on some of the concepts we've brought in from that. So in mobility and walking, we heard a little bit about that kind of impact. Activities of daily living, GI distress, and sleep are just a few of the concepts we're covering. And so even though we're not getting at things like social and mental functioning directly, we are getting at a very broad range of the impacts on patients that just isn't, is your swelling bad or good today? And so this is really meant to be a comprehensive, to the extent it can be, assessment of the overall experience of swelling and its impacts. Go ahead and advance. So what's next for us? We have the drafts of some of our measures, as I mentioned, and we're currently testing those to make sure that they're understandable to people who would be ultimately completing them and filling them out, and that they're relevant and really capture what patients experience. In the spring of this year, we're kicking off a large-scale quantitative validation study to make sure that the measures really are reliable, valid, and interpretable enough to be used in clinical trials. And then we are, in the background, kind of working on a potential daily diary measure or measures that capture the daily impact of swelling episodes in the case of remitting and relapsing disease, as things go up and down very quickly. which would be a little bit different than the way a lot of times PROs are included in clinical trials, which is, how do you change from, say, a baseline time point to some months down the road after treatment. So we're really trying to cover a diversity of situations and diversity of experiences with these diseases. Go ahead and advance. So with that said, I want to say we'd like to collaborate with everyone we possibly can. And if you know anyone who's experiencing swelling from the kidney diseases I mentioned, we have opportunities to participate in our studies in a variety of ways, I should say. If you scan this QR code or go to the link there, you can find out more about that on our website. And of course, anyone from the team would be more than happy to talk with you about potential participation. And I just want to wrap up by thanking everyone for joining and expressing my appreciation for being here. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Devin, for sharing about this really important work that's going on. So we're going to open it up for questions and discussion now. I actually have one question to start with. We heard from Seferiana that her doctors, didn't always ask her about the full impact of the edema she was experiencing on her daily life, and really the impact that those symptoms had beyond just the swelling itself. And although this is being developed for use in clinical trials, do you think that the Prepare-NS instrument might ultimately also be a useful reference for clinicians just as they interact with their patients in that clinical setting?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. I think we're learning more over time that especially as participants and patients have the opportunity to complete surveys through electronic medical records in advance of visits, it really can create scores that we can reference over time to understand, what are your symptoms like? Are we seeing an improvement over time in a measurable way? And having that data point to start a conversation, I think is always helpful for the clinician.
That's great. All right, I see we've got a question from Kevin Fowler. Kevin, you can unmute and ask if you like.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly have enjoyed this this presentation. My question is for Devin, and just in terms of when this is going to go into clinical trials. It looks like it won't be able to go into clinical trials, this project, until 2026, or at least at the earliest. Is that correct?
The answer is a researcher's answer, Kevin, which is maybe. So we are working as hard as we can to build a network of sponsors who are active in drug development in this area and work with them very closely, both in formal and informal ways, so that they're part of our committees who advise us. And then also how do we collaborate with them in getting earliest versions possible of the measures in trials so that we can see how the measures work in trials, and then having those early versions in some trials will help just build them into the infrastructure, even if it's not the very final version. So, the final version that we sort of introduced to the whole world at the end of 2026, that'll take until that time, but that doesn't mean we're not also working behind the scenes with drug developers to speed up that timeline as much as possible, so that we can hit the ground running and try to benefit patients with these measures as soon as we possibly can.
Thank you very much.
And following on from that, Devin, I know we actually have some people on this call from industry today. If they are interested in learning more about participating as sponsors and becoming part of that process, are you open to being contacted about that?
Absolutely, yes. We want to. We've been conducting interviews with many sponsors, pharmaceutical and by the way, non-pharmaceutical drug trialists, people who are doing this from other types of institutions, but really everybody who's working in this space that we can talk to or trying to talk to just see where there might be overlap and how we can work together. And so anyone who thinks they have a way to work with us, please do contact us, and we really do want to talk to you.
Excellent. We have a couple of questions that came in over the chat. And so Don Davis is asking, do you feel this project and the data and outcome from it will speed clinical trials or change primary endpoints?
I'm happy to give my 2 cents and hand off to Eloise, but my hope is both. My hope is that we are generating measures that can be included as important endpoints in clinical trials, not just way down the list as exploratory, but that play a major role, and that in doing so, this part of the issues to date across medicine with including PROs and trials is that there's a lot of back and forth about what the trial measure is. And so because we're doing this, in a way that we know corresponds with what FDA is looking for and with their collaboration, the hope is that when you are developing a drug in this space and it fits for the drug development project you're working on, you can point to Prepare-NS and then FDA already knows what you're talking about, and they know whether or not it fits or not, and hopefully that does provide some efficiency.
Thank you.
All I would add is to say, in addition to developing the measures, one of our missions is also to provide some guidance on how best to use them. And so hopefully by taking those steps, exactly as Devin was saying, we can make the process of incorporating measures like these as seamless as possible for industry.
Yeah, and I'll just add, you saw the plethora of trials out there right now, as opposed to even 5-6 years ago in nephrotic syndrome, the different glomerular diseases. At some point, I hope that we get a lot of great drugs that decrease proteinuria, probably in the 30-40% range. But what might differentiate those different drugs are the impact that the drugs have on volume overload. And so not all drugs are equal, obviously, but if you get that 1 or 2 drugs that impact these PROs a little bit better, now you've got a differentiator and something that patients can really lean on. So, and that'll obviously impact FDA decision-making, CMS, reimbursement, all that good stuff. So big role to play.
Thank you. I see we have a few hands up. Madhuri, would you like to ask your question? Doesn't seem to be going through there. Let's see. Joanna?
Oh, Joanna, you may be on mute.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm from Germany. I speak for a patient initiative for nephrotic syndrome in Germany. And I'm very happy to hear that patients' experience is paid such an attention. That is wonderful to hear. I'm very grateful for that. And I have a very simple question. Could you please show again the slide where the people working with the initiative Prepare-NS are working, so I could have another look at it? Maybe I find somebody I know. Thank you so much.
Feel free to get in touch with us too. Absolutely. And that if you scan that QR code that we showed earlier, we can.
Thank you.
Yeah. We can absolutely would love to chat with you and can coordinate with anything you would like to sort of consider together. And then you can also just learn more about our project at the website as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep, and as Devin mentioned, it's actually quite a broad group of people who are participating in it, even beyond the team on this page.
Yeah, this would be a small proportion of people involved directly or indirectly. So.
Yeah. So we've also got a question about where can we learn more about additional PRO trials in glomerular disease? And Devin, I know you mentioned that you did a review through clinicaltrials.gov. I have to admit, I don't remember if it's possible to actually filter by the endpoints on ct.gov.
No, but we've compiled that information, and so we will be publishing our findings of that formative work, hopefully in a variety of places. But of course, always happy to chat prior to the publication of that. I think the short answer is that it's very hard to directly find out, where PROs exist in current trials in this space, and so hopefully, when we compile that information and get it out publicly, that will be somewhat useful.
Yeah, I'll mention also that one of ISGD's projects we are currently working on behind the scenes is collaborating with NephCure to build the next generation of the Kidney Health Gateway website, which is a trial matching tool where patients can find trials that may be appropriate for them to join or learn more about. And having some more visibility into PROs and what other endpoints are being evaluated may be something that we can do there. And we've got a question from Brenda. Is there a role in reducing or eliminating sugar in contributing to edema? And
I would look at Eloise. Yeah, I mean, I think as was said, we usually think about salt more than sugar as being a contributing factor for edema. But in terms of an overall healthy diet and the side effects of many of these medications, often watching sugar intake becomes important as well.
mm-hmm. All right. Let's see. We're almost at time, but Mallory, do you want to?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you. Perfect.
No, I did not get the unmute button earlier. So anyhow, thank you very much, for the nice presentation and an update. We have been following this for a while. And my question is more so along, and this is both for Eloise and Devin. This is FDA from the FDA grant, but as we are preparing for this validation study, are you guys meeting with the FDA to get some input on the protocol and design? Because as you said, we start planning of incorporating this in the clinical trials. Those things will be really helpful.
Yeah, we meet with them on a monthly basis, and everything we do is submitted to them and discuss with them thoroughly. Their participants in the project fully, and they're on the team, in addition to just being the funders.
Great. And Barbara, thank you for your comment too. This is in addition, and from the patient perspective, this completely makes sense to be a part of the study, right?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Laura.
All right. Well, thank you all again so much for joining us. If you would like to know about future upcoming webinars and other events from ISGD, you can sign up for our mailing list on our website, which is is-gd.org. We also have a calendar of glomerular disease-related events on our website, not just the ones that we host, but all kinds of conferences and webinars and educational activities that are related to this field. And once again, I want to thank our participants today. Safariana, thank you so much for sharing your first person experience. I know this is tough to talk about, but we really appreciate your willingness to share it. And Devin and Eloise, just really admire the work that you are doing with this study. And I'm sure that our audience has really appreciated hearing about it. And it's exciting to think about where it's going to go and how it's going to improve the options in clinical trials. Barbara had to drop off, but really appreciate her participation as a moderator as well. All right. Thank you all, and I hope we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Laurel.
Thanks, everyone.